My wife confessed to cheating right before she died. The shock shattered me, but I stayed and forgave her until the very end. Her family, however, never forgave me. They hated me just because I told our son the truth. Welcome to Storytime Reddit, everyone. I never thought that a marriage of nearly 20 years could come to such a quiet, almost unnoticeable end. We met in college and got married right after graduation. Life together wasn't bad at first. We had a bright, sweet little boy, and for the first 10 years or so, I truly believed I was happy. But over time, things started to crack, slowly and silently, like a thin fracture across a window pane. Eventually, both Rytami wife and I realized that whatever love we had was gone. We were just roommates by then, living in separate worlds under the same roof, trying to maintain a peaceful facade for our son because he was still too young to understand. And maybe the hardest part of it all was that we didn't hate each other. We just didn't belong to each other anymore. Every conversation felt forced, every hug or kiss became a formality, and deep down, we were both asking ourselves why we were still holding on to something that had already died. One evening, after I finished washing up from dinner, she called me into the living room. Rita was sitting there, looking more exhausted and fragile than I'd ever seen her. She told me she wasn't happy, that this marriage had become an empty shell, and she thought it was time we set each other free. I thought I'd feel heartbroken hearing those words, but I didn't. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. I agreed almost immediately. We decided we'd wait a few days to get emotionally ready, and then we'd sit down and explain everything to our son that we were going to separate. We had a plan. Everything seemed settled, until a week later, Rita was diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer. I remember sitting in the doctor's office, holding her hand as the words were spoken. It felt like the air was sucked out of the room. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble, she just nodded quietly, but I could see something inside her collapse. From that moment on, all talks of divorce were shelved. How could I walk away from the woman who was just handed a death sentence? How could I abandon the mother of my son when she needed me most? Regardless of our differences, I had loved her on so deeply. We chose to keep living together, not as husband and wife, but as two companions in a battle no one asked for. I took care of her every day, took her to chemo, stayed up through the nights she was throwing up from treatment, bore witness to her pain, both physical and emotional. I've never once regretted that choice. But there's something I haven't mentioned yet. Before her diagnosis, Rita had been unfaithful. She confessed it to me one late night as we sat in our dimly lit bedroom. She told me she hadn't planned to ever say anything, but after finding out she was dying, her conscience couldn't let her carry that secret to the grave. I sat there, feeling like my chest had caved in. For the past 6 months, she'd been sleeping with someone else even while we still lived under the same roof. She said she was waiting until after the divorce to tell me, but now she couldn't hide it anymore. I didn't say a word, not because I didn't feel betrayed, but because how do you stay angry at someone who's dying? The betrayal stung, but it didn't change the reality in front of me. So I chose to forgive, not because she deserved it, but because our son needed to see his mother loved until the very end. After Rita passed away, the house became eerily quiet. There were no more soft footsteps in the morning, no more faint coughing at night, no trace of the woman who had been my wife for nearly 20 years. It was just me and my son now, living together in a strange sort of void. It wasn't exactly relief, but it wasn't sharp grief either. It felt like being stuck in some in-between state because even though the person was gone, she hadn't truly felt like mine in a long time. Still, the memories lingered, every little detail, every broken shard surfacing in the silence of the night. I never told my son the truth about our marriage. He was only 12 at the time, far too young to understand that his parents had been on the verge of divorce, or that the gentle, devoted mother he adored had quietly betrayed her husband. We buried it all in silence, not to deceive him, but to preserve his world just a little longer. Only the adults in the family from both sides knew the full story. I once thought that was enough, that I could carry that secret with me forever, and eventually rebuild a life when things settled down. I didn't rush to move on. After the funeral, I told myself I needed time to heal, emotionally and physically. But loneliness has its own way of creeping in, slipping into the corners you never thought were vulnerable. 6 months after Rita died, I met Lana at a company event. She worked with one of our client teams, and our first interaction was just a typical work meeting. But afterward, I couldn't get her smile out of my head. There was something about her, something warm, gentle, and quietly reassuring. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't pursue her. In fact, Lana was the one who asked me out for coffee after our third project together. I turned her down the first 2 times, still feeling like saying yes would be a betrayal of the woman I'd buried. But the third time, I said yes. That coffee changed everything. I laughed more, talked more, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel lost in my own life. We started seeing each other quietly. I didn't tell my son. I didn't tell Rita's family or mine. Only a couple of close friends knew. I was afraid of judgment. Afraid people would say I was moving on too quickly. Afraid they'd think I'd forgotten Rita. But that wasn't the truth. I still remembered her. I still kept her photo in our bedroom. I still taught my son how to fold his shirts the way she used to. But I also began to understand that I had a right to happiness again. Before she died, Rita told me not to stay trapped in the past. She told me I deserved someone new, and when I was ready, I should open my heart again. And I did not impulsively, not out of desperation, but because for the first time in years, something genuine stirred in me. Lana and I were together for nearly a year before I decided to introduce her to my son. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew he wouldn't just accept another woman stepping into his mother's space, but if I was serious about this relationship, the truth had to come out. So I brought Lana home one weekend afternoon. That first meeting didn't go anything like I had hoped. I had prepared for every possible reaction, but nothing could have braced me for how cold my son's response was. From the very moment Lana walked through the door, he looked at her like she was an intruder, not the woman his father had just introduced as someone serious. He wasn't rude, he didn't say anything cruel, but the way he kept his distance, the way he acted like she wasn't even there, it hurt more than if he had screamed in anger. I knew he was still grieving. I thought that after nearly a year, maybe he'd be ready for some change. Maybe I was wrong. I didn't blame him. How could I? From his perspective, he was watching his dad move on from the woman he thought would be there forever. But I also didn't want to hide anymore. I had spent too long pretending in my marriage, at the funeral, through the silence that followed. All I wanted now was to live honestly with him, with myself, and with the woman I cared deeply for. Lana understood. She never once blamed me for his attitude. Instead, she made gentle efforts to connect. She asked questions, tried to start conversations, even cooked meals I'd mentioned were his favorites. But all he gave in return were polite nods, short "yes ma'ams," and a quick retreat to his room as if her presence alone was a burden. Still, we stayed patient. I believed that if we stayed sincere, eventually he'd see that I wasn't betraying anyone. I was just moving forward from something that had ended long ago. Then one day, Lana told me she wanted to move in with me. It made me hesitate, not because I doubted my feelings for her, because I didn't. I loved her, but I didn't want to add to my son's pain. Lana had gone through a heartbreak of her own. Her last relationship ended in betrayal. Her ex had hidden the fact that he had a wife and kids in another state. She wasted 4 years on a promise that never came true. So she was clear with me. If I was serious, if this was something real, she needed a symbol of commitment, a ring, a promise. I didn't need to think long. Deep down, I already knew Lana wasn't just the woman who came after Rita. She was the one I wanted to build something lasting with. A few days after our talk, I proposed. She cried, not out of shock, but relief. And for me, it felt like a new chapter finally turning. But the day I told my son about the engagement, everything shattered. He screamed at me in the living room, eyes red and filled with rage. "You're forgetting Mom too fast, aren't you? She's been gone less than 3 years and you already want to marry someone else?" I froze. I didn't know how to calm that kind of hurt. But I knew this: if I didn't tell him the truth about everything, the marriage that had already ended before Rita died, the emotional wounds we both buried, would always see me as the one who broke our family. So that night, once he had cooled down, I sat beside him, took his hand and said, "There's something you need to know. Your mom was with someone else before she got sick. We were going to get divorced, but when she was diagnosed, I chose to stay. Not for love, but out of duty, out of a promise, and for you." My son looked at me, eyes clouded with doubt. I knew that in that moment, I wasn't just telling him a hidden truth, I was gambling with the last bit of trust we had left between us. I wasn't sure if my son fully grasped everything I shared with him that night, but at least he sat there and listened in silence. He didn't say anything, just gave a slight nod and turned his face away. I respected that. I knew I couldn't force anyone to accept the truth overnight, especially not a kid who had just lost his mother and was now carrying a truth that even grown adults sometimes don't have the courage to face. So I gave him space, and that space turned into a tense silence that lasted almost the entire week after. I didn't bring Lana up again, and I didn't push him to talk. We carried on with our routine meals, cleaning, watching the evening news, but everything felt distant. I could almost see it in his eyes, like he was silently wondering if the man sitting in front of him was still the father he had trusted all his life. And I felt like I was standing between two worlds, one where my son was the center of my heart, and another where Lana was the woman I'd chosen to walk forward with. I didn't want to lose either. But I had no idea I was about to lose more than I ever expected. One night after dinner, the doorbell rang. It was my former in-laws Rita's parents and her younger brother Jonathan. They showed up unannounced, with unreadable expressions and a tension in the air I hadn't felt since the funeral. I opened the door and invited them in. But before we could even sit down, Lana walked out of the kitchen drying her hands with a towel. The air shifted instantly. I knew this moment would come, but I wasn't ready. I tried to explain things respectfully, saying that Lana and I had been seeing each other for nearly 2 years and we were now engaged. My ex-mother-in-law stayed silent, while Jonathan gave a short nod, but the displeasure on his face was obvious. I didn't blame them, but I also didn't believe I had done anything wrong. After a few cold pleasantries, Jonathan asked me to step outside for a smoke. I knew that was just an excuse to have a private talk. As soon as we got outside, he started interrogating me when I met Lana, when exactly I proposed, all sorts of subtle digs to see if there was any overlap. I tried to answer calmly, but I was already burning inside. I didn't think I needed to justify my private life to the family of someone who was no longer here, especially when I had stood by her through every step of her illness without ever asking for anything in return. When I mentioned that my son had initially reacted strongly but eventually accepted Lana, Jonathan's expression shifted. "You actually told him about Rita's affair?" he snapped. I nodded. And just like that, his outrage exploded. He called me selfish, said I was emotionally damaging a kid who still hadn't processed the loss of his mother. I let him rant, because no matter how furious he was, I held on to one thing: I didn't need to defend myself. I just wanted peace for my son. When we went back inside, I saw Jonathan whisper something to his parents. Moments later, they all stood up, offered a rushed goodbye, and left. But in their eyes, I saw judgment and disappointment. Not long after, my ex-father-in-law called. He said they were deeply disappointed that I had shared everything with my son without consulting them first. I gripped my phone tightly, trying to stay calm. This was my son, my truth, my right to live honestly. They said I had destroyed my son's image of his mother, but I saw it differently. My son deserved to know the truth, and I deserved to live without hiding from what I had endured. What I didn't know then was that this phone call wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning of a much bigger storm coming straight for us. I thought things would finally settle down after that phone call. But just a few days later, on a quiet weekend morning, the doorbell rang loud and insistent. When I opened the door, there stood Jonathan, my former in-laws, and a man I didn't recognize holding a stack of documents. Their faces weren't cordial anymore, just cold and determined. Jonathan gave a smug smile and said, "We brought the paperwork. It's time for you to sign over custody. Clearly, you're no longer fit to be a father." I froze for a few seconds. I didn't invite them in. I asked them what the hell they were talking about. Jonathan waved the papers like they were train tickets. "You hurt the boy. You dragged him into adult problems. You smeared his mother's memory when she's not here to defend herself. You're not worthy." I tried to stay calm, but inside I was boiling. Did they really think they could take my son from me just because I told him the truth? I told them to leave, but Jonathan started shouting into the house, "Come on, buddy, come downstairs. We're here to take you back to your real family, your mom's side." The yelling pushed me over the edge. I shoved Jonathan back, probably harder than I meant to, and he stumbled. But then he lunged at me, and the next thing I knew, we were grappling on the porch like two unhinged idiots. I'm not proud of that. Lana ran out, trying to pull us apart, and soon my ex-father-in-law and their lawyer jumped in to break us up. That's when my son came running downstairs. He stopped, frozen, watching the chaos unfold. I told him to go back to his room, trying to sound calm, but Jonathan kept going. "You can leave now. You don't have to live with a father like this." And then my son spoke calmly, clearly. "I'm staying. This is my home, and my dad is the only person who's always been here for me. Not you, not anyone else." His words hit the air like a lightning strike. Silence followed. Jonathan tried again, claiming he was too young, too manipulated, too emotional to really know what he wanted, but my son shook his head. "I don't need rescuing. I know what I'm doing. I know who my mom was, but I also know who raised me for 15 years. In that moment, I felt more at peace than I had in months. My sonth person I feared might turn away from me had just chosen to stand by my side, but Jonathan wouldn't quit. When he started shouting at my son, calling him stupid and ungrateful, I lost it. I shoved him hard enough this time to send him stumbling backward. I slammed the door and yelled, "If you people show up at my house again, next time the police will be answering you." After they finally left, I walked back inside. My son looked at me, eyes red but trying to smile. I pulled him into a hug, holding him tight like I was just realizing how much he'd grown. He may only be 15, but he was braver than I ever imagined. And in that moment, I knew no matter how many storms came our way, at least he and I would be weathering them together. After that chaotic day when Jonathan and my former in-laws showed up with a lawyer trying to strip me of custody, I fully expected the drama to continue: calls, legal threats, unannounced visits. But after I blocked all contact and my son did too, everything went quiet. No more ringing phones, no more banging on the door. For the first time in a long while, I felt a strange calm. It wasn't perfect peace, but it was something. Still, under that quiet surface, I was struggling. I kept asking myself, was I really right to tell my son the truth about his mother? Or had I just said it to ease my own guilt and move on? I opened up to Lana about it. She listened without interrupting, then gently said, "You didn't do anything wrong. You deserve happiness, and no matter how painful it is, the truth is still the truth." Her words helped, but what really stuck with me was her suggestion. Ask your son. Don't assume. Let him tell you what he feels. That night, I sat next to my son in his room and said, "I want to hear what you truly think about everything." At first, he gave me the usual lines. "I'm fine. It's all good, Dad." But then he broke down. Not the angry tears from before, but quiet, raw emotion from a kid who'd been carrying too much for too long. He told me that after learning about the affair and the near divorce, he'd started seeing our family differently. He felt guilty, like his very existence had forced his mom and me to stay together when we were both unhappy. I held him close and said, "Never think that. You weren't the reason we stayed in pain. You were the only reason we kept going. You saved us in more ways than you'll ever know." For a long moment, we just sat there, holding hands in silence, but it felt like a bridge had finally been rebuilt. Then I said, "We need help, you and me. There are wounds we haven't dealt with, feelings we've buried too deep. I think we should go to therapy both individually and together." He looked at me, eyes still red, and simply said, "Yeah, I want that too. I don't want to stay angry. I want to understand Mom better, and I want you to be happy." The very next morning, I made the call, booked our first session. When I told Lana, she smiled and said she'd be there for both of us in whatever way we needed. And that was the moment I knew our story wasn't perfect. Our past was still full of scars. But for the first time in a long time, our future felt honest. No more lies, no more pretending, just a father, a son, and the life we're choosing to rebuild together. After my son and I began therapy together, it felt like a slow but steady sunrise after a long, cold night. The air between us became lighter. We weren't weighed down by silence anymore. The awkward eye contact, the stiff nods, the short answers, they all started to fade. We talked more openly, not just about the past, but about what lay ahead. I could tell he was beginning to heal, and that gave me the courage to open up further. There was one last truth I had kept from him, something I had been unsure whether he was ready to heart the reaction from his grandparents and Uncle Jonathan when they found out I had told him everything about Rita. I shared that only a few days after he agreed to let Lana move in with us, they showed up unexpectedly and found out she was living under our roof. I told him how they had looked at her like she didn't belong, like she had invaded sacred ground. Their polite congratulations had felt hollow, more like formalities than support. But it didn't stop there. Jonathan pulled me aside under the pretense of stepping out for a smoke and immediately launched into an interrogation. He asked intrusive questions, trying to piece together a timeline, hoping to catch me in some betrayal of his sister's memory. I kept my composure and told him the truth. Yes, my son knew everything, and yes, he had given me his blessing to move on. That's when Jonathan lost it. He accused me of destroying the last pure memory my son had of his mother, claiming I had selfishly poisoned his mind. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I was just done. Done with being the villain in their story simply for choosing to live honestly. When I finished recounting the story, my son didn't react with shock or anger. He just nodded and said, "I figured they'd act like that, but they don't get to choose what I should know. That's between us. No one else." Hearing him say that, it was like finally exhaling after years of holding my breath. But the calm didn't last. A week later, on a quiet Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Jonathan, my ex-in-laws, and a lawyer standing there, holding legal documents. They wanted me to sign away custody of my son. They believed I was no longer fit to be his father simply because I had told him the truth. I told them to leave, but Jonathan shouted my son's name like he was saving him from some monster. That was it. I snapped. I shoved him hard, and soon we were locked in a messy, shameful fight on my doorstep. Lana came running out to stop us, and so did my son, drawn by the chaos. Jonathan turned to him and said, "You don't need to live with someone like him." My son didn't flinch. Calmly, he said, "I know who my mom was, and I know who my dad is. I'm staying." That shut everyone up. They kept pushing, but my son stood his ground. "I don't need rescuing, but if you don't leave, I'll call the cops." In that moment, I knew I had done something right. My son knew the truth, and he still chose me. That truth, that trust, meant more than anything in the world. After that chaotic day, I thought the tension would never lift. That peace was nothing more than a fantasy, but surprisingly, that day marked a shift. Jonathan and my ex-in-laws haven't contacted us since. No texts, no calls, not even a passive-aggressive post online. Whether they've given up or are planning something quietly, I don't know. But I'm not scared anymore, because now I have my son by my side, and I have Lana, woman who chose to love a man with scars and history. A few months ago, Lana and I finally got married. It was a simple ceremony in our backyard, small and heartfelt, with just the people who truly mattered. My son was my best man. Watching him hand me the ring with pride in his eyes made me realize how far we've come. People say you can't build something new from pain, but I disagree. If you build with honesty and love, healing can happen even in places that once held only grief. We've kept up with therapy, all three of us. My son is slowly letting go of the belief that we stayed in a broken marriage for his sake. He's learning that his mother, like all of us, was human, capable of both love and mistakes. That lesson hasn't been easy for him, but he's handled it with maturity beyond his years. I've learned to allow myself to feel joy again, not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. And Lana? She holds us together in the quietest ways. She never pushes, never demands, she simply stays. One night, we played a board game Rita used to love. My son laughed, really laughed for the first time in a long while. That sound echoing through our home felt like a second chance. We'll always carry the past with us. Sometimes my son still looks at old photos of his mom, and I'll always remember her as part of my life, but I don't carry anger anymore. I've forgiven for my son's peace and mine. If Rita's family ever wants to talk, I'll listen. If not, I've let them go. These days, I wake up to laughter and shared coffee. And honestly, after everything, that's more than enough.